I've seen men cry over lost cattle, over a drought that baked the earth until it cracked like old pottery, and over a woman's laughter remembered on a cold night. But I've never seen a man cry like Jedediah Harlow did on that October evening. It was a sound that clawed its way out of him, something raw and ragged that had been caged in his chest for years. He was a man who, by his own admission, had stopped believing in the good of anything except the dirt under his boots and the brand on his cattle. He was an island, a fortress of solitude and silence. We were riding together, checking the south fence line, a chore that was usually a comfort in its monotony. The sky was that deep, bruising purple that comes right before the stars punch through, and the air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. A long day's work behind us, the promise of a hot supper ahead. That's the kind of quiet that makes a man feel like he's exactly where he's meant to be. I was thinking about the new mare I'd just broken, a fiery thing that reminded me of my youth, and how nice it would be to finally sit down and take the weight off my feet. The world felt small, manageable, and utterly predictable. That's the moment, I reckon, when life likes to remind you that you don't know anything at all. It was then, from the direction of the wind-scoured arroyo, that I heard a sound that didn't belong. A thin, reedy wail, like a newborn lamb lost from its mother. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. I've been riding the range for nigh on 40 years, and I can tell you this. The prairie is a poor place for secrets. It's too wide, too open, the sky too big. You'd think a fella could find a corner to hide his past, but the wind will find it, the sun will bleach it, and the coyotes will sing about it. That's the kind of place I've always needed, a world where my own history felt as small and insignificant as a grain of sand. I was a man who'd let the world do its worst, and I'd done nothing but turn my back on it. The only thing that could make me feel like I had any power at all was the feel of a good horse between my knees and the sight of my herd, healthy and growing. I'd been that way for so long, the idea of someone needing anything from me felt like an offense. It was an intrusion, a crack in the wall I'd spent so long building. My name is Silas, but folks call me Sil for short. I had a wife, a long time ago, and a boy. The boy was taken by a fever when he was barely 3. The wife, well, she couldn't stand the silence of the plains and the ghost of our son. She moved back east, to some city where the noise was enough to drown out her own memories. I didn't stop her. I remember the day she left, standing on the porch, watching her wagon get smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon. I knew I could have called her back. I could have promised to change, to be more than the hollow man I'd become. But I didn't. The silence had already become my only true companion. The only thing I had left to feel was the bitter taste of my own failure. It was a meal I ate every day. That's the lens I saw the world through, a muddy gray filter of my own making. I was a man whose heart had been worn down to a hard, flat stone. So when I heard that cry, that sharp, scared sound of a child, my first thought wasn't a man's thought. It wasn't to rush to help. It was to feel irritation, annoyance, a sudden, sharp anger at this world for being so damn needy. The wail came again, a little weaker this time, and my horse, a stout bay named Chester, pricked his ears and turned his head towards the sound. He was a good animal, always had a softer heart than me. I pulled his reins a little tighter, making him snort in protest. "Easy, boy," I mumbled, my voice a dry rasp. "It's probably a coyote pup, or a bird, nothing for us to worry about." But it wasn't a coyote pup. As we drew closer to the arroyo, I could see a small shape, a huddle of rags and dust at the bottom of the rocky gulch. The sound was a breathless, desperate sob now, not a scream. It was the sound of a creature that had exhausted its fear and had moved into a desolate sort of acceptance. My horse stopped, refusing to go any further, his sides heaving. He knew, even if I was trying to pretend I didn't, he knew I had to look. I dismounted, the leather of my saddle creaking in the sudden, profound silence. I walked to the edge and peered down, and there she was. A little girl, can't have been more than 7 or 8. She was a mess of tangled black hair and a face so smudged with dirt it was hard to make out her features. Her clothes were torn and her feet were bare. Her small body was trembling, a fine, constant shiver that seemed to come from her very bones. In her arms, she clutched a small, crooked stick as if it were a weapon. She was a tiny, forgotten creature, a piece of debris washed into a gully by the cruel currents of life. She looked up at me, her large, dark eyes brimming with tears that had cut a clean path through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, sir," she whimpered, her voice so small it was almost swallowed by the wind. "I'm lost. I can't find my way home." "Where do you live?" I asked, my voice coming out gruffer than I intended. She pointed a shaky finger, a vague gesture towards the west, towards a stretch of land that was nothing but cactus and scrub. "With my mama and my tata." "What's your name?" "Luna." She said it like it was a secret, the most valuable thing she owned. A story, a lost child, a frantic family. It was a story as old as the hills. I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to help. I was supposed to pick her up, put her on my horse, and find her people. But I didn't move. I just stood there looking at her. Because a part of me, the part that was a fortress of my own sorrow, was telling me this was a trap. There were Apache in these parts, and they were known for setting traps. I could see them now, hiding in the shadows of the rocks, waiting for me to be vulnerable, to climb down and be an easy target. It was the thinking of a man who'd been living on his own for too long, a man who saw an enemy in every shadow, a man who couldn't trust the simple plea of a child. My mind was a battlefield of logic and suspicion. "This is how they get you," the voice in my head hissed. "A decoy. They'll pick you off like a sitting duck." I'd heard the stories of ranchers and settlers led into an ambush by a crying child. I was a man who lived by a code of self-preservation, and my self-preservation was screaming at me to get back on my horse and ride away. I looked at her again, this time with a cold, analytical eye. She was skinny, too skinny. Her ribs were visible through her torn dress. Her breathing was shallow. She looked up at me, and for a second her gaze wasn't that of a scared child, but of a creature that had learned the meaning of hunger and fear. She wasn't a trap. She was the aftermath of a trap. I shook my head, banishing the paranoid thought. "All right," I sighed, the weight of a decision I'd rather not make settling on my shoulders. "All right, come on, I'll take you home." Getting her out of the arroyo was a struggle. She was too weak to climb, and the rocky slope was steep. I had to go down, a wave of vulnerability washing over me with every step, and lift her up. She was as light as a bundle of dried sticks. I set her on Chester, and she clung to the saddle horn with all her might, her knuckles white. I held the reins and walked beside the horse. My rifle was now in my hand, held low, not pointed at anything but ready. A small part of me, the cynical old part, still half expected an arrow to sing out of the darkness. She directed me in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Over there," she'd say, pointing towards a cluster of rocks, then, "No, not there, further." It was a strange journey, traveling through the purple dusk with this silent, ghost-like child. She had a stillness to her that was unnerving. She didn't fidget, didn't complain. She just sat there, a bundle of misery and silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if expecting something terrible to appear at any moment. I tried to make small talk, to break the tension that hung between us as heavy as a wet blanket. "You live with your mama?" I asked. "Yes," she said, her voice hollow. "And your tata?" I said, trying to recall the word for father. "He's gone," she said, and the finality in her voice was so absolute it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Gone, like vanished, like dead. It wasn't a child's grief I heard. It was a child's acceptance of a bleak reality. It was the same voice I'd used to describe my wife leaving. It was the sound of a heart closing itself off to the world. We walked for what felt like an hour, the landscape growing more desolate, the shadows longer. The stars were out now, a brilliant canopy of cold, distant light. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the hard ground and the soft, steady breathing of the horse. And then I saw it. It was a ramshackle structure, a collection of twisted wood and rusted tin, leaning precariously against a rock outcropping. It looked like it had been built by a child, a haphazard attempt at a shelter that had long since surrendered to the elements. A single weak light flickered from a window, a candle or a small fire that was fighting a losing battle against the encroaching night. There was no smokehouse, no garden, no corral. Just this pathetic, dying collection of sticks and hope. The pony, who had been snuffling nervously the whole way, finally let out a low, uneasy whinny. He knew, before I did, that what was waiting for Luna at her home was more sorrow than a man can rightly bear. The world, it seemed, was about to get a whole lot heavier. The smell hit me first, long before we reached the crooked door. It wasn't the smell of a home. It was a smell that was sharper and more metallic, the smell of sickness. I felt a knot form in my own gut, a primitive warning system telling me to turn back. The horse I was leading was almost as reluctant as I was. He kept balking, his ears flat against his skull, his breath coming in short, nervous snorts. Even the creatures of the earth knew this place was a monument to suffering. Luna slid off the horse before I could help her, landing in a soft thud on the dusty ground. She didn't look back at me. She just ran, her small, bare feet slapping against the hard-packed earth straight towards the door. It was a low door, barely tall enough for me to fit through without stooping. It was made of old, weathered planks, warped and cracked with a crude leather hinge. Luna pushed it open, and a sliver of warm, orange light spilled out, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of illness got stronger, and I could hear a faint, rattling cough from inside. I left Chester tied to a dead, gnarled mesquite bush. My hand instinctively went to the stock of my rifle, a gesture of pure habit. I had no idea what was in that house, but everything about it felt wrong. It was a feeling of suffocation, a feeling that the very air was heavy with sorrow and loss. I had to duck as I stepped through the doorway. The inside of the shelter was even more depressing than the outside. It was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 10. A small, dying fire sputtered in a stone hearth, its smoke spiraling up to a hole in the roof that was haphazardly patched with a piece of tin. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the room, and on it, a single, fat candle burned, its wax pooling on the wood like a tear. The place was a jumble of discarded objects, a rusted cooking pot, a broken chair, a pile of filthy rags in the corner that was apparently a bed. But my eyes were drawn to the far corner. Luna was there, kneeling beside a crude pallet of dry grass and a worn-out blanket. On the pallet lay a woman. Even from where I stood, I could see how thin she was. Her skin was stretched taut over her bones, giving her face a skeletal look. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was lank and tangled. Her hands, which lay over the blanket, were all long, delicate fingers and prominent knuckles. She was the shadow of a human being, a woman who was being consumed from the inside out. Luna was gently stroking the woman's hair, whispering in Spanish. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the fear and sorrow in her voice. "Mama, I'm home. I brought a man. He's going to help us." The woman on the pallet, Luna's mother, turned her head slowly, a monumental effort that cost her a gasp of air. Her eyes, so dark they were almost black, found me. I was frozen in the doorway, an intruder in this sacred space. I didn't belong here. I was a man who had built his life on avoiding such human entanglements, and now I was trapped in the very heart of one. Then the woman saw me and did something that nearly broke me. She smiled. It was a weak, fleeting smile, a ghost of a smile that was more about charity than joy. It was a smile that said she was grateful for the help, even if help was futile. It was a smile of resignation. "Come in, senor," she said, her voice a thin, rasping whisper. "Please do not stand in the doorway. It is cold." I walked in, feeling like a giant clod, my dusty boots tracking more dirt onto the already filthy floor. I took off my hat, a gesture of respect I hadn't offered anyone in years. I felt clumsy, stupid. I was a man who could handle a spooked horse, a fire, a stampede, but I had no idea what to do with this. "I was out checking my fence," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small, cramped space. "I found her in an arroyo. She said she was lost." The woman, her name was Rosa, as I would come to learn, nodded weakly. "She has started to wander," she said, looking at Luna with a heartbreaking tenderness. She is looking for food. She is looking for her father. She is looking for a world that is not so empty. Luna, hearing this, crawled into her mother's arms, burying her face against her shoulder. The woman's thin, bony hand came up and rested on the girl's head, a gesture of pure, unconditional love that was so powerful I had to look away. I stared at the fire, at the flickering flames, trying to keep my composure. I spent the next few hours, the deepest, blackest hours of the night, doing what I could. I gathered more wood for the fire, which was a sad excuse for a pile of twigs. I found a small pot and boiled some water, making a thin, weak broth from a piece of salted pork I had in my saddlebag. Rosa could barely swallow it. Luna did, her small hands wrapped around the tin cup, the steam warming her face. She ate like a small, feral animal, with a desperate efficiency that told me she hadn't had a proper meal in days. It was a stark, painful reminder of the child's reality. The woman told me her story in fragments between fits of coughing. It was a story of poverty, of a man who had come home from the army broken and bitter, of land that wouldn't grow, of a winter that had taken him from her. "He went to find work," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "A month ago. He said he would be back. He never came." She believed he was dead. She had been sick for weeks, a terrible cough that had ravaged her lungs. Luna was her caregiver, her provider, her only hope. I sat on the broken chair, listening, the weight of her despair settling on me like a physical burden. This was the point in the story where I should have said something. I should have offered comfort. I should have said, "It's going to be all right." But I couldn't, because I knew it wasn't. I was a man who had seen enough of this world to know that happy endings were for fairy tales, for people who believed in something better. I was a man who had stopped believing in anything a long time ago. I looked at Luna. In the flickering firelight, I saw the resilience etched into her young face. She wasn't afraid of her mother's sickness. She wasn't afraid of the dark or the cold. She was afraid of being alone. She saw her mother, her only tether to the world, slipping away, and she was fighting a battle she was destined to lose. She was doing the very thing I had refused to do all those years ago for my own family. She was staying. Rosa fell into a fitful sleep, her breathing a thin, wheezing rasp. Luna sat beside her, her small hand resting on her mother, keeping a silent vigil. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do with myself, so I just sat there, a lump of useless flesh, thinking. I thought about the life I had chosen, the isolation, the silence, the freedom from all of this. I had convinced myself it was a virtue, but sitting here in this house of bone and memory, I saw it for what it truly was, a cowardice. For years I had told myself that my sorrow was my own, and that by sealing myself off from the world, I was protecting myself from more pain. It was a simple, clear, and utterly false equation. I hadn't been protecting myself. I had been burying myself alive. I thought about my wife. I thought about how she had tried to reach me after our son died. I thought about how she had begged me to talk to her, to let her in, to share the grief. And I had turned her away. I had done exactly what I was feeling an overwhelming urge to do right now, to leave, to get back on my horse and ride away from this quiet, devastating misery, to pretend I hadn't seen it. Luna looked up at me, her dark eyes full of a profound sadness that seemed far too ancient for her years. "My Tata said there are good men and there are bad men," she said, her voice a soft, hollow whisper. "He said the good men stay." I had a choice to make. I could be the bad man. I could leave, forget about this place, and go back to my comfortable life of solitude. It would be easy. It would be what the old Seelas would have done. I could ride back through the night, pretending I hadn't seen the raw, bleeding heart of humanity, and sleep soundly in my own bed. I could, and for a moment I seriously considered it. The urge to flee was a physical pull, like a tide dragging me back to the shore. But then I looked at Luna again. I saw the hope in her eyes, a desperate, fragile hope that I had no right to extinguish. I saw the courage in a tiny girl who was facing the end of the world and refusing to run. She was a better person than I was. She was a warrior, and I was a deserter. Finally, I got up from the broken chair. Luna tensed, watching me, probably expecting me to walk out the door. Instead, I walked over to her and knelt down. The dirt floor was cold and hard. "Where is your axe?" I asked, my voice gruff. My throat was tight. I hadn't felt this vulnerable in decades. "What?" she asked, confused. "To chop wood. Your fire is dying." Her face, which had been a mask of stoic endurance, crumbled. A single tear and then another carved paths through the dirt on her cheeks. She didn't say anything. She just pointed to a corner. There, propped against the wall, was a small, rusted hatchet, a pitiful tool for a girl to have to use. I walked over and picked it up. It was light, far too light. As I stepped outside into the bitter cold, the wind hit me like a slap. I looked up at the stars, a million in different points of light, and I made a promise. I promised them that I would stay. I would stay until the end, no matter how painful. It was the first promise I had made to anyone in a very long time, and I was terrified I wouldn't be able to keep it. The sound of my own breathing was the only sound as I gripped the hatchet, my heart, for the first time in years, beating with purpose. The sun rose, a pale, reluctant orb that cast long, thin shadows across the desert floor. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night chopping wood, a pitiful pile that would be gone in a day, but it was something. I had sat by the fire watching Rosa sleep, and I had watched Luna sleep too, curled up beside her mother like a small, defenseless animal. It was a fragile tableau of suffering and love. I rode back to my homestead, a journey of a few hours that felt like an eternity. I packed up supplies, a bag of flour, some coffee, a side of bacon, an old, heavy blanket, and a few other necessities. I didn't think, I just did. I was a man on a mission, and the mission was to keep a promise. I returned to that ramshackle hovel before noon, my horse laden with goods. Luna was outside, sitting on a rock, looking at the horizon. She perked up when she saw me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a look that both warmed and scared me. Rosa was worse. The cough was deeper, more persistent, and there was a shadow under her skin, a pallor that spoke of a body nearing its end. I had a basic knowledge of medicine, enough to know that there was nothing I could do except make her comfortable. Her lungs were filling with fluid. I could hear it in the rattle of her breath. It was the sound of the final war. I took charge, a role that was as foreign to me as a lace dress. I cleaned the small space as best I could. I boiled water and made a thin broth, forcing Rosa to take a few sips. I talked to Luna, telling her stories about the plains, about the animals I'd seen, about my life as a cowboy. It was a clumsy attempt at reassurance, a way of filling the silence with something other than the sound of sickness. I told her about Chester, about how I'd once ridden him through a stampede, and how he was smarter than most men. She listened, her eyes wide. The second day turned into the third. The days were a blur of quiet labor and simmering tension. I was a man of the open range, not a caretaker, and every moment in this small, suffocating space felt like a test of my spirit. It was a confinement that chafed against everything I was. On the fourth day, Rosa had a moment of lucidity. She opened her eyes and they were clear, focused. She looked at me, then at Luna, and a terrible understanding passed across her face. "Luna," she whispered, her voice so weak I had to lean in to hear it. "Mija, go outside for a moment. I need to talk to the Señor." Luna, who had been stroking her mother's hand, looked up with a protest on her lips. Rosa gave her a look of such gentle command that the girl immediately complied. She walked out the door, leaving us alone in the dim, fire-lit room. Rosa turned her eyes on me. They were full of an immeasurable sadness, the weight of a life that was slipping away. "You are a good man, Señor," she said. I shook my head, denying it. "I'm no such thing." She ignored my protest. "The day you found her, I was praying. I was asking God to send an angel." A weak, rueful smile touched her lips, "and he sent a cowboy." I felt a burning in my throat, the sharp sting of tears I had refused to shed for years. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice cracking. Her expression turned serious. "Promise me," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "Promise me you will not let her be alone. Her Tata is gone, he is not coming back, and I will be gone soon." She took a ragged breath, her chest heaving. Luna is so brave, she is like a little warrior, but even warriors get tired. She needs someone to fight for her, she needs a home. The request hung in the air, a terrible, beautiful burden. It was a promise that would change everything. It would mean giving up my solitude, my fortress, my carefully constructed life. It would mean being responsible for another life, being vulnerable, having something to lose. It was the very thing I had spent 40 years running from. I thought of my own boy. I thought of his small face, his laughter, the way he would reach for me. I thought of the emptiness that had followed his death. I thought of my wife's silent departure. I had failed them all. I had been a coward who fled from the wreckage of his own heart. Now I was being given a chance to be something else. I was being given a chance to stay. I looked at Rosa, her eyes fatting. I saw the love she had for her daughter, a love so fierce it had kept her alive this long. And I knew, with a clarity that was sharper than any I had ever felt, that I couldn't refuse her. I couldn't turn my back on this child the way I had turned my back on my own. I reached out and took her hand, her skin as thin and fragile as a dried autumn leaf. "I promise," I said, my voice a low, guttural growl. "I promise you I will take care of her." A wave of relief, so deep and profound that it was almost palpable, washed over Rosa. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "Gracias," she whispered. "Gracias, señor." She looked past me to the door where her daughter stood, just out of sight. She smiled one last time, a radiant, peaceful smile that was meant for no one but her child. Then she closed her eyes. Her breathing, which had been a constant, labored effort, became quieter and quieter until it stopped. The silence in the room was deafening. I continued to hold her hand, staring at her face, which had been transformed by death into something serene, something that had finally found peace. I felt a knot in my chest, a profound sadness that wasn't my own, but was for her struggle, for her courage. After a long moment, I heard a small sound behind me. I turned. Luna was standing in the doorway. She had seen it all. Her face, so young, so fragile, was a mask of silent grief. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. Not yet. She walked forward slowly, mechanically. She came to stand beside her mother, and she reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it on her mother's forehead. I couldn't speak. There were no words, so I just got up, walked over to her, and knelt down. I opened my arms, a gesture so foreign to me it felt like I was moving through water. She hesitated for a moment, just a heartbeat. Then she threw herself into my arms, her small body racked with sobs that were so deep and so raw they felt like they were tearing her apart. I held her. I didn't tell her it was going to be all right. I didn't make her empty promises. I just held her, feeling the weight of her grief, sharing the burden of her sorrow, the weight of a promise. And for the first time in 40 years, I let myself feel the tears that I had kept locked inside for so long. I wept for her mother. I wept for her future. And I wept for the boy I had lost, the boy whose name I hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. We stayed like that for a long time, a man and a girl, two broken souls finding a strange, fleeting comfort in each other's arms. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed the grief inside the small, ramshackle house. I knew in that moment that my life as I knew it was over. I had made a promise. And I would keep it for her, for Rosa, for the boy I had failed. The winter that followed was the hardest I've ever known. Burying Rosa was a brutal affair. The ground was frozen solid, a foot of hard-packed earth that I had to chip away at with a pickaxe. Luna stood beside me, her face pale, her breath misting in the cold air. She didn't say a word, she just watched. I had marked the grave with a simple wooden cross, a rough-hewn marker that I carved with my own knife. It looked pitiful, a poor tribute to a woman of such strength, but it was the best I could do. The day we covered her with the cold earth, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if I was burying my old life along with her. Bringing Luna to my homestead was like introducing a wild animal to a cage. She was silent, watchful, her eyes forever scanning the horizon, as if expecting her mother to walk over the next hill. She would not eat, only pushing the food around her plate. She would not talk, only answering my questions with a curt nod or a shake of her head. She spent her days sitting on the porch, staring out at the endless plains, her small frame a silhouette against the vast emptiness. I didn't know what to do with her. I'd never had to care for a child. My own son was a memory, a ghost. I was a man of few words and gruff habits. I didn't know how to comfort. I didn't know how to coax a smile. I was a rancher, a loner, a man who spoke to his horse more than any person. And now I was responsible for the life of a traumatized little girl. The irony wasn't lost on me. The universe, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. The first few weeks were a disaster. I would make her breakfast and she would stare at it. I'd try to get her to help me with simple chores and she would just shake her head and go back to her spot on the porch. I was constantly frustrated, a feeling that would quickly be followed by a crushing wave of guilt. What did I know about raising a child? I couldn't even keep my own family together. One night after a long, silent day, I was fixing a broken piece of tack by the fire. Luna was sitting in the corner, curled up on a small cot I had brought in for her. I heard a soft whimper and then the sound of crying. It was a muffled sound, as if she was trying to hide it. I stopped what I was doing. I felt that old, familiar urge to retreat, to bury myself in my work and pretend I hadn't heard it. It was the same old instinct that had cost me my wife. But I had made a promise. So I put down the leather, walked over to her, and sat on the floor beside her cot. She flinched when I sat down, pulling her blanket tighter. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice a low, gentle rumble. I know I'm not good at this. I'm not good with words. I don't know how to make you feel better." I felt like an idiot. She looked up at me, her face tear-streaked. "I miss her," she whispered. "I miss her so much." "I know you do," I said, my voice soft. "I miss my son too. I had a boy a long time ago. He died." She looked at me with a kind of shocked curiosity. "Your son?" I nodded, the memory rushing back as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "His name was Caleb. He was just a baby. He got sick and I couldn't save him." It was the first time I had spoken of it in so long. It felt like I was pulling a dagger out of my own chest. I looked at my hands, the hands that had failed to save my son, the hands that had also failed to save Rosa. They were just hands. They were useless. "I was so sad when my mama died," Luna said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I would ever stop being sad." "You won't," I said, the truth of the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You never stop being sad. You learn to live with it. You make room for it. You build a new life around it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Did you build a new life?" I looked at her. The question hit me like a physical blow. The answer was a resounding no. I hadn't built a new life. I had built a fortress. I had built a prison. I had made my grief the center of my existence, a sun around which everything else revolved. I had been so consumed by my loss that I had forgotten how to live. "No," I said, the admission a painful one. "No, I didn't. I just tried to pretend it didn't happen. I made myself forget." She slowly reached out a small, hesitant hand and placed it on my gnarled, calloused one. It was a touch so light, so tentative, it felt like a feather landing on my skin. "Maybe we can build a new life together," she said, her voice full of a child's simple hope. It was the first time she had said we. It was the first time she had included me in her future. I looked at her, this tiny girl who had suffered so much, and I saw a strength in her that I had never possessed. She was offering me a tether to the world, a chance to stop drowning in my own past. A deep, shuddering breath escaped my chest. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, I think we can do that." The winter was long and cold, but we found a way to survive it. I taught her how to care for the horses, how to mend a fence, how to spot the signs of a coming storm. She had a natural way with animals. The skittish Chester took a liking to her, which was more than he ever did for me. She would tell me stories her mother had told her, legends of the old ones, of warriors and spirits. I would tell her about the stars, about the constellations that guided the travelers across the plains. We were two loners, learning to be together. Spring came, a welcome explosion of green and life. The prairie bloomed, a riot of color, and Luna, for the first time, smiled. It was a hesitant, crooked smile, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time, but it was a smile. It made the whole world feel a little less heavy. One day I was in the barn repairing a harness when I heard laughter. It was a sound so foreign to my life that it took me a moment to place it. I walked out to see Luna riding Chester bareback, a wild grin on her face, the wind whipping her long black hair behind her. She was alive, she was free, and she was happy. It wasn't a fragile happiness, a flimsy thing that could be shattered by the next gust of wind. It was a real happiness, a happiness born of resilience. As I watched her, I realized that I was happy too. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling. It felt like the sun was finally shining on a part of my soul that had been in shadow for decades. I had been so scared of this, so terrified of the vulnerability that comes with caring for another person. But it wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was the only thing that made life worthwhile. I thought about Rosa and her final request. I had promised her I would care for her daughter, but I hadn't truly understood what that meant. I thought it was a burden. I thought it was a sacrifice. But it was the opposite of a sacrifice. It was a gift. Luna had given me back my life. She had shown me that there was still a world to be lived in, a world of laughter and hope and connection. She had shown me that it was never too late to start again. I walked out into the sun, my hand shielding my eyes from the glare. Luna saw me and pulled Chester to a stop. Her face was flushed with exertion and joy. "Uncle Silas," she called, "come ride with me." I looked at her, a wave of love so powerful washing over me that it made my knees weak. I knew then that I was not the same man who had ridden out to check the fence all those months ago. I was a different man. I was a man with a purpose. I was a man with a family. The journey that had started with a single, overlooked cry had brought me to a new destination. I was home.